Well, good morning on our Happy Mother's Day. Hope everything's going well with you. Beautiful day we have. Let's get started with a word of prayer this morning. Michael Randolph, would you lead some prayer, please? If you follow along in the little book about the Nichols Encyclopedia, today's topic is total depravity, get it right out. But the definition of this word or this thought is a state of corruption due to original sin that infects every part of man's nature and to make the natural man unable to know or obey God. This particular doctrine has come from Calvinism. If you're familiar with Calvinism and the little tulip part that they talk about, each letter stands for a part of Calvinistic doctrine. Well, the T stands for total depravity. Well, how do we know who teaches that? You get out there and you go to maybe different churches, but one sure way to know if this doctrine is taught, do they baptize babies? Do they baptize their infants? And that's one way to know that this is taught, if they baptize infants. Because this false doctrine teaches that babies are born with sin. They're born sinners. So you got a little bitty baby that just comes into the world, and according to this teaching, you got to baptize that baby. They generally have a certain time frame which that baby is to be baptized in, and therefore the baby's sins are forgiven. And these sins come from Adam all the way through, which we have inherited those sins. That's why they baptize little infants. Because if that little baby were to die without being baptized, and when I say baptized, it may not be immersion. It may be just a few droplets placed on the baby's head or sprinkles, something like that. But if that baby were to die before it is baptized, and that baby's soul would be lost. Well, again, that goes totally against the Scriptures from the standpoint of infants and being sinless. I've often wondered, what do they consider an abortion? How would they look at the child from that standpoint? If a child is, becomes a child at conception, and then the child is aborted, what happens to the soul of the aborted child? You can't baptize that child. I don't know. I never asked anybody about that believes in that, but still it might be a good question to come up with and to ask. So it comes from this particular teaching comes from Psalms chapter 51 and verse 5, one of their main verses that they use. And here it says, this is David speaking, he says, "Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me." So they look at this verse among a couple other verses. I was brought forth in iniquity, in sin my mother conceived me. They say that right there the child is already a sinner while the child is even in the womb of the mother. But it's interesting to look at here that we don't take one verse totally out of context. That David is writing this psalm soon after Nathan the prophet came to him and confronted him about the sin that he committed with Bathsheba, and also the sin when he had Bathsheba's husband murdered in battle, Uriah the Hittite. That's what this whole chapter is about. God is confronting David. David is here showing his repentance of this. And what Psalms 51 is about is David showing his repentance of this particular sin. This one sin. The sin with Bathsheba. The sin with having her husband killed. It's not about sin in general. That's not what David is talking about. David is repenting of this particular sin. And that's what he's trying to get through to God and have cleansed. If we go to Psalms 51 and verse 2, back up a couple of verses, David says, "Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin." So it's one sin here that David is speaking of, not sin in general. David certainly had other sins in his life. He wasn't the perfect individual, but here David is calling attention to this one event. Because this one event was a time when David was not after God's own heart. This one event is a time here when David just went totally off and did this. Willfully, he did this, knowing that it was wrong. And David here is repenting of this one particular sin. Well, how do we know this? How do we know that maybe this is not referencing just sin in general? This is referencing that one sin. Well, look what is said about this David in 1 Kings 15 and verse 5 concerning his life. Because David did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and had not turned aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. Is God saying here that David all his life did everything right? I mean, he never committed any sin except that one time? No, that's not what the writer here of 1 Kings is telling us. He's not saying that David was absolutely perfect except one time in his life. But this one time is when that willful sin came in there. He did what he knew was wrong, and he did it anyway. And that's when God called him on it. And God was about to take his life. If he hadn't repented, if David hadn't repented when Nathan went to him and confronted him on this, God would have taken his life. But David repented. That's what Psalms 51 is about. But David had other sins, no doubt. But during the sin that he had, he was trying to live right before God, a faithful life before God. But yet, here he got off track. And that's where he got in trouble. So, this verse contradicts the doctrine of total depravity. It contradicts it because this verse says David did everything right up to the time of this matter with Uriah. So if he did everything right according to this particular false doctrine, if he did everything right, then where's the sin he had as a child? So total depravity. David wasn't born with sin no more than anybody else is born with sin. But he sinned, we know, prior to this matter right here, but he was doing his best to live a faithful life to God. And that's the same thing true of us. We try to live a faithful life before God. Sure, we're going to have our sins that we're going to commit, but it's that willful sin that we know is wrong, that we plan it, we just totally disregard God whatsoever. I'm going to do it anyway. That's the willful sin that we got to look out for. But our faithful living, we know according to 1 John 1 verse 7 through about around 9 in there, that we have the blood of Christ that cleanses us when we walk in the light. Well, David was walking in the light, all but except for that one particular moment there when the sin took place. So we go back to Psalms 51 and verse 5. Again, David says, "Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me." David is saying, I've been a sinner all my life. That's what he's saying. From the time he started sinning, for the rest of his life, he was a sinner. Same thing is true of us. When did we start sinning? Can you remember your first sin? I can't remember my first sin. No way. How old was I? I have no idea. But at some point, I started sinning, knowing that it was wrong. And I haven't stopped. I'm still sinning today. Every day, how much? I don't know how much. can't keep a number of it. But yet that's what David is saying here. Since I started sinning, I've been sinning ever since. I was born in a world of iniquity, just like we all are. Where we're born in here, we've got to survive in a very sinful world. A world that David was in, the world that we are in. So ever since we started sinning, we become sinners. Little babies can't sin. No way. Little babies aren't lost because you don't need to save a baby because they're not lost. So David here is showing that Psalms 51 and verse 5, again, when he started sinning, he didn't stop. But there was one sin in particular, which he willfully did. God was very much angry at David because of what he did. Anything on that particular verse, Psalms 51:5, that's where a lot of this is taken from. Another verse that's used is in Psalms 58 and verse 3 to show total depravity. It says here, the wicked are estranged from the womb. They go astray as soon as they are born, speaking lies. This verse is used, showing, okay, look at there. There they are. You have babies, as soon as they're born, they're speaking lies. If we're going to take this literally, that's how you got to take it if you're going to be one of these that go with it. This word estranged there meaning wicked. Have you ever heard a mother say, when it's the first time she holds her baby, oh, this is the most wicked baby I've ever seen? Never heard that. These babies are so wicked when they're born. Babies aren't wicked when they're born. Do they go astray? Are babies born to be able to talk? They come out and start lying? The first words come out of their mouths a lie? Well, no, that's not what he's speaking about here. No means is he speaking that way. But for those who believe that a child is born in this world sinful, again, they see that baby wicked when he comes out and going astray. Whenever he starts talking, everything's a lie. Well, if you're going to take it literal like they are, then you have to have babies here just a few minutes old already speaking lies. I've heard of babies being born with teeth. I never heard a baby being born of being a liar. Come out and start telling lies. But that's not what he's speaking of here. Again, we are born in a world that's very unfriendly, a world that's very wicked. We are influenced by the world. The world does have an influence on us. We're even influenced by our parents. Our parents have an influence on us. So what he's speaking of here, how these two factors influence us. The world has an influence. Our parents have an influence. If our parents or the world had bad habits or wicked habits, we may very well pick up on those. Hopefully we don't. If they do, we change. But the world has an influence. That's what he's speaking about right here. We go astray. Folks telling lies, we get by with telling a lie. We tell a lie. So it's not a good thing, but yet we are influenced by things around us. Before one can sin, from a child's standpoint, we've got to have the power of reason. Children, little babies can't reason. They don't know right from wrong. Nothing like that. But infant doesn't have that. So therefore, Psalms 58:3 is talking about the influence the world has on us. And when that takes place, at some point at the age of accountability, it takes place and we begin sinning. A good verse to show that we are not accountable for what our parents and grandparents and go all the way back to Adam shows is Ezekiel 18 and verse 20. The soul who sins shall die. The son shall not bear the guilt of the father, nor the father bear the guilt of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself. We're not held accountable for the sins that our father did, grandfather, or mother, or grandmother. We're going to be held accountable for what we do. we're going to stand before God on our own. We're not going to be standing before God as a family, giving account individually. So the soul who sins shall die. We should not bear the guilt of the Father. In the same form here, fashion, same thing is true of our righteousness. It may be our parents are very righteous individuals, Christians, great Christians. When we stand before God, we can't borrow some of their righteousness and say, well, my parents were good folks, so can I borrow some of that? And God's going to say, no. You're on your own. It's your righteousness. It's what you have, how you stand before me. And you can't go into heaven with a shirt tail of someone else. So we are responsible for our own sin. We're responsible for our own righteousness. It's our choice how we want to live. Our choice. And we'll give an account for it. Another verse is Ezekiel 18 and verse 4. Behold, all souls are mine. The soul of the Father, as well as the soul of the Son, is mine. The soul who sins shall die. The soul who sins shall die. Something you got to do. You don't inherit it. It doesn't say the soul that inherits the sin shall die. The soul who sins. Something you got to do. And it's something that we all do. So we're not born with it. It's something that we do in life. Not anything that we inherit. So another verse here, Ezekiel 18 and verse 4. Sin is something that we do. Not something that we are inherited with. If total depravity is right, and the little child is lost, according to a couple of verses we're fixing to look at, we've got to become like that little child in order to go to heaven. That means we've got to become like them, like sinners, if that false doctrine is correct. Look at two verses here, Matthew 18:3 and Matthew 19:14. 18:3 says, this is when little children have been brought to Christ. But surely I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. And then 19:14, but Jesus said, let the little children come to me, and do not forbid them, for of such is the kingdom of heaven. Christ is saying to those adults around him, you got to become like this little child if you want to go to heaven. You got to become like this little child if you want to be a part of the church. Be like that. Now, if this little child is a sinner, as some claim, that means I need to become like that little child who's a sinner in order to be a part of the kingdom. Again, that reasoning doesn't work out either. Again, sin is something that's got to be forgiven. It's got to be washed away. That only comes by the blood of Christ. It comes at baptism. So these little children here that before Christ, they were sinless. And Christ knew it. And we got to become like them, sinless, before and be converted as they are and become sinless before we can have a part in the kingdom of heaven itself. So two verses that show the sinlessness of a child. Another verse, Romans 3 and verse 12. They have all turned aside. They have together become unprofitable. There is none who does good, no, not one. Notice there, he says they have become unprofitable. You can't become unprofitable unless you once were profitable. You can't become, as he says here, no one does good. No, not one. Well, we don't. But at one time, we did do good as children, as we were sinless at one point. These individuals here, they went bad. You know, milk can go bad, but at one time it's good. Meat can go bad, because at one time it's good, but it can go bad. We go bad. We come to this world perfect, We have no sin, but at some point we go bad. And that's what he's speaking of here. They have become unprofitable. It's what one time they were profitable, but now they have become unprofitable. So Romans 3 and verse 12 shows that at some point, the sin begins to overtake us here, or take it upon, we begin to participate in the sin. But before that time, we were in good shape. Another verse that Romans speaks about is Romans 5:12. Therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men because all sinned. Adam was the one to introduce sin to the world. And once it got started, it couldn't be stopped. It got started and it spread to every one of us today. We live in a very sinful environment. One man's sin affects us all, especially from the standpoint of death. There's the spiritual death. There's the physical death. It all got started with him, and we can't stop it. Christ is the only one that could stop it from affecting us. From a spiritual standpoint, he gave us life so that we wouldn't have to suffer spiritual death. He stopped that. And also, from the standpoint of death keeping us down, he was resurrected. And we're going to die if the Lord doesn't come back. But death is not going to keep us down. It's not going to have this total control over us as it did one time. So Adam introduced it to the world, and it got started and it can't be stopped. It's like this COVID thing. It got introduced somehow, and yet now it can't be stopped. It's affected all of us in some way or another. It can affect a person. And then Paul says in Romans 7 and verse 9, I was alive once without the law, but when the commandment came, sin revived and I died. Paul here is speaking of a time when he was once alive without the law. I think Paul is speaking of his young age, childhood, maybe just young childhood age when he was sinless. As a child, he didn't need the law because there was no sin there. He didn't need it. Just like little babies today, they don't need the gospel. You don't go and preach the gospel to a little baby. They don't need it. They're not lost. They don't need it. But once he understood what sin was about, then he became alive to it, understood it, what it was about. I think Paul here is speaking about a time before the age of accountability, a time when he was sinless, and a time when he understood, when he crossed that threshold, I guess, and became a sinner and understood what the law was meant for him. So this doctrine is a very ungodly doctrine. If you find somebody who teaches this, who believes in it, and we all do. We all know somebody who believes in this. Just come up and ask them, do you think that little baby's lost? What has that baby done? They might even go to the part of the abortion side of it. What about that baby? That baby didn't have opportunity. If they're going to teach that particular thing about baptizing with children. So here's a doctrine that got started several hundred years ago, and it's still with us today, a false doctrine, several hundred years ago. It's still with us today. But yet it goes totally against the scriptures on the innocence of little babies. Any comment on the total depravity? All right, we'll pick up next week on the next topic that we'll cover. If you get your book and look out, be searching the scriptures and know a little more about it. Thank you for your attention.